the one kind of exploratory thing that we started doing was this study with ketamine. So we had a partner who sponsored a study on looking at, could a person wear Kernel Flow while experiencing a psychedelic experience?
That's how I got to this call today, man.
Cool. Well, that's quite an evolution, I would say. And I'm guessing when you started 17 years ago software developing, this is not the end point you imagined.
No, I'm not a billionaire yet, so.
Okay. Yeah.
Still working on it.
Cool. Well, I can tell you a little bit about myself. So I, did a PhD in electrical engineering at Columbia, and in that I was developing custom camera chips that look at not the color of light, but the temporal properties of it. So how it changes over time. And these timescales are really short, on the order of nanoseconds. So, and the reason this is interesting is because a lot of biological molecules have properties that can be measured optically through these very short timescale measurements. And so it's a technique called fluorescence lifetime imaging, and it's all based on time of flight measurements. So I had a PhD basically designing custom time of flight chips. And in that, I kind of learned everything from the device layer. So how the PN junctions of diodes that detect the light, all the way up to the software layer work. So kind of everything in between, designing the circuits, designing the boards, writing some low-level firmware, writing software. So it gave me this really broad experience to start out with, and kind of a good understanding of whole systems. From there, I had a short time at Intel working in their research labs on some biosensing platforms. And then went on to a startup called Quanergy, where I was developing a LiDAR sensor. So going back to my roots and what I did my PhD on, and doing time of flight measurement. We send these pulses of laser light out and see how long it takes to come back. So we know the speed of light.
That's why you're measuring them. You measure them for that? Because I was making notes. By the way, if I look down, it's because I'm making notes. But I was like, why would anybody care about why light changes on a nanosecond level?
Yeah, well, so in LiDAR, that's kind of on a microsecond level. So it's different time scales, but same principle. So you're pulsing laser light and looking at microsecond time scales. And so I worked there for a few years, developed some, detector technology, built up a team, kind of grew that kind of detection team up quite a bit. And then I was approached by the team at Kernel and Brian Johnson, who had this idea of measuring the brain using time of flight on the nanosecond timescale again. So going back to these shorter timescales that I had done my PhD on. And so the concept is you put in a pulse of laser light and you look at how that light changes over time for this, short, few nanoseconds. And that tells you something about the properties of the tissue inside the head. And you can, by detecting changes in those properties, tell what parts of the brain are active in a certain time. And this is kind of a well understood phenomenon. It's been around for many decades, but it had previously existed as kind of racks of equipment in, a research laboratory, and never as a, integrated device. And so sounded like a challenging problem. And, I had the right skills. I had the experience building the teams, and kind of decided to join and start helping build up that technology and figure out what exactly to build and how to build it and what the right technology stack was, and, everything along the way to get to what is Kernel Flow today. So it took us about 4 years, a little over 4 years to get here. But we've got something working, and we're kind of putting the finishing touches on the production release for later this year.
What can I do with it?
Okay. It's a great question. So I'll tell you what it does fundamentally, and then we can talk about what that could tell you kind of from an applications perspective. So fundamentals, are you familiar with a pulse oximeter? So you may have like a smartwatch that has like an SpO2 sensor in it, or if you've gone to the doctor or hospital, they clip on your finger. That's a pulse oximeter. It's measuring the oxygen in your blood. And so fundamentally, what we do with Kernel Flow is we generate a map of blood oxygenation across the entire brain. So we're seeing small differences in oxygen in your blood throughout the brain. And what that tells you is what parts of the brain are active. So as the brain does work, or parts of the brain does work, it needs, or those parts need some oxygen in order to, do the metabolism, to, fire the neurons to produce the function. So Kernel Flow measures that change in oxygenation. And, this is what's called a hemodynamic measurement. So we're looking at changes in hemoglobin oxygenation. So, the hemoglobin is the thing that carries oxygen around in your bloodstream. And we're measuring how much of it has oxygen versus how much of it doesn't. And we use a technique called near-infrared spectroscopy. So we use 2 wavelengths of light, which is a spectroscopy component, and it allows us to differentiate the oxygenated versus deoxygenated. So high level, we're measuring blood oxygenation as a map of your whole brain. And, what you can do with that is you can start to ask questions like, what is my brain doing when I'm just sitting, kind of daydreaming, staring off into nothing? And this is what's called, resting state. This is what the brain looks like when nothing is going on.
Yeah, resting brain face.
Yeah, resting brain face. And so it's just like one very simple example. Another is, I think you probably saw some of the work we've done, like playing video games, right? So like what is happening in the brain when a person is playing video games? And we have this hypothesis that, we would see actually almost the entire brain light up. Like you're using so much of your brain playing a video game. You're using your motor cortex to control a mouse or keyboard. You're using your prefrontal cortex to plan out activities and how you're going to move or what your next point in the game is. Your visual cortex is lit up as it processes all of this, visual information coming in. The parts of your brain handling auditory are processing sounds, like trying to, a lot of games use spatial audio type tricks to give you, signs and cues for what's happening in the world you're in. So much of your brain is being activated by video games. And we actually saw this in some of the measurements we took, is that, when you play video games, tons of stuff is happening. It's not actually bad for your brain. You're actually working out the entire brain when you play these games. So, and those are just a couple of examples. I mean, we could probably talk all day, like, could you measure the brain while doing X? And the answer is probably yes. And one of the things that Kernel Flow enables is asking questions in a new way, because it's now a portable device and you can kind of use it in more naturalistic environments. And we could talk a little bit, if you're interested, in kind of what the legacy devices, what the whole history of functional brain measurement was built on, and how those don't really quite provide the same type of experience.
So you took something, made it better, portable, and you're doing an infrastructure play where you're building these, basic electronic infrastructures that people can then build applications and things on top of.
Yeah, I would definitely call it kind of a platform play where you've built this. The worst, best analogy I have is like it's like the iPhone, right? Like it's the hardware technology that's needed to enable so many new applications. And can I dream of all those applications today? No, right? Like who knew when the iPhone launched that the most used app would be TikTok in 2022, right? Like no one would have predicted that. And I would say the same thing about a device like Kernel Flow, which is really kind of a platform for building applications on the brain, on information about the brain. And I don't think any of us today can predict 10 years from now what the significance of that will be, or what the most used app would be in that kind of ecosystem.
Does hair gel interfere with it reading your brain? Like, how does hair style, hair products, does that interfere?
Yeah, so so we use an optical technique. So as I mentioned, we're firing light into the head, and you can imagine anything that blocks light is going to block signal. And so hair is one of those things that's a little bit of a challenge for us. Hair gel, I think the only problem it would cause is that it makes the hair kind of clump together more. So you kind of have a harder time fighting through it. But what we've done is actually kind of neat. We designed these modules with kind of spring-loaded tips on them. So they're kind of like mini brushes that you kind of put on your hair and kind of wiggle around as you get it into place, so it can get down and touch the scalp. So if you had gel in your hair and a nice hairstyle when you started the day, you take measurement with Kernel Flow, that's no longer going to be true. But then you have Kernel Flow hair, which is I think a mark of pride in itself, right? So,
is there anything like at your labs? If I fly, where are you located, by the way?
We're in Los Angeles.
So if I fly out to Los Angeles, right, and put on one of your helmets, what do you call them? I'm sorry, you probably don't call them helmets. What do you call them?
So I try and call them headsets. But helmet is a very common thing. Headset sounds a little nicer. Helmet's like, I'm putting this on to protect my head, whereas headset is like, this is, I don't know, like a
you're too deep in the space. You're too deep in the space. Because like from an outside, I'm like, oh, that's a helmet. If it covered my eyes, I'd probably say headset. Does it cover your eyes? No, it's just
it
a
does
helmet.
not. No,
it's like a metal hat type deal. It looks like a helmet actually, and at least the version that I saw on the Lex Friedman video podcast, it didn't have obviously helmets have the face mask or face plates, whatever they're called, but it was metal and it was large and it went on your head. And so you, I completely forgot my my
You're going to fly to LA.
Fly to LA. Put the headset on. What would I be able to do with it? Like right now, today, like could I play a game and like think about things and have it move characters? Like what could I do with it today?
Yeah. So one of the, I think, most interesting demos that we've been working on these days is a focus training demo. So this is kind of a neurofeedback application where you try to focus on a topic or focus on a thing or let your mind wander. And so you kind of train your brain to be able to kind of modulate between these two different states. And so it's something that, I don't know if you've practiced any mindfulness or meditation type things, but it's something that kind of fits into that space where you can get a feedback, a score, based on your brain activity of how well you were focusing or how well you were mind wandering. And so you can use that score as quantified information to say like, I'm doing better, I'm doing worse. Like, let me try different techniques. Let me, change what I'm doing so you can improve. And so it's a really interesting thing because it gives you immediate feedback. It is something that we measure in real time. So you don't have to like wait for it to go to the cloud and get processed, where a lot of our earlier kind of demonstrations and things we're doing. We still have all of that capability and use it quite heavily when we look for kind of larger scale, kind of big data type results. But this is kind of an individual, personalized feedback system that we've been developing. And there are a lot of applications for it outside of just mindfulness, right? Like you can imagine all the things you could do if you could improve focus or improve, some dimension of your thinking, whatever it is, whatever label you apply to it, whether it's focus, mind wandering, attention, stress.
Monitoring classroom kids, force them to learn.
Yeah, I feel like that's been done using similar technology in other countries, and not something that would be, I think, received too favorably here in the U.S. But it's an idea, and maybe some people would opt into that if they really were motivated to learn most efficiently. It's an interesting question, actually. I think personally is if you're going to invest time into learning something, how can you do that the most efficient way possible, right? Like some people just aren't good visual learners, or some people don't learn from reading text. And so it's like, what's the right combination for you as an individual to optimize your learning?
I think I can learn and extract, I don't think there's a medium to where it does not work for me, but I believe that the bandwidth of information that I get in some mediums is significantly more beneficial than others. Obviously, like I can read somebody telling me what to do. I do some woodworking now. Like recently I started, building cabinets and pantries and stuff. And I was like, all right, I can read it, but if I just watch somebody do it, like that's just so much easier for me to then go replicate. But I was curious, can you tell if your brain is like tired or fatigued? Cause like, at the end of the day when you're just burnt, can you put the helmet on and be like, am I burnt or do I have like some more in me?
Yeah. We can't yet. Like we don't have an app for fatigue yet. Kind of our first app that we're building is this focus type of one. But I think it is possible, right? And the reason I think it's possible is we've done some other things. Like we did a study. It's maybe about halfway through right now, data collection, where we're giving people alcohol, and you're looking at a placebo and then 2 different doses of alcohol up to the legal limit 0.08, and seeing how their brain changes in response to the alcohol. And what you find is that there are some compensatory mechanisms. So you see the brain activating parts of it to overcome alcohol to an extent. So when you kind of get this lower dose, people on average show this compensatory mechanism. But then at a certain point, close to the 0.08, you actually see that compensation fades. So your brain is no longer able to make up for the impairment caused by the alcohol. And I bring this up in the context of fatigue because it's probably something similar. It's like, I'm feeling a little bit tired. And just push through. You can do it a little bit longer. You probably engage a little more of your brain, overcome some of that, that fatigue you're feeling. But at a certain point, you're probably just like, all right, like I am completely burnt. Time to call it a day. And so we haven't measured it, but I could see it being something within the possibilities of what we could measure. And it kind of parallels, like I was saying, this kind of impairment type of study that we had done or in the process of doing.
Nice. And then, sorry, I see the mouse.
Oh, do you?
I see the mouse. He's under the table. Have you ever put this on mice? Have you ever used mice in your testing at all?
No, every test we've done has been on humans. So the technology itself kind of fundamentally is safe for human use. And, I actually, one of the interesting things about Kernel is that it makes it so more people can get their brain measured without a kind of medical condition. So I'd never had any kind of brain measurement done before I joined Kernel. And I've done dozens or maybe hundreds at this point of brain measurements.
Like
just
size?
as
Size of your physical brain?
No, just like, what's going on inside my brain? Like, what's my brain doing? So, we've done all our testing on healthy volunteers. Important. So people choose to kind of participate and help evaluate this. It's safe. We use safe levels of light. So we never had to do anything in animal models or mice, pigs, anything like that. And I don't know, you mentioned kind of seeing our headset or our big metal helmet as you described it, and that isn't really mouse size. So we'd have a little bit of an engineering challenge, I think, just to make a system small enough that could go on a mouse.
Oh man, have you found anything new or interesting about humans in all of this research?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've had the technology online for a little over a year, and a lot of that time has been doing things that have already been done. So what we call validation tests. So showing that our system can reproduce the same results that others have gotten previously. The one kind of exploratory thing that we started doing was this study with ketamine. So we had a partner who sponsored a study on looking at, could a person wear Kernel Flow while experiencing a psychedelic experience? And we chose to use ketamine for that because it is probably the most easily accessible psychedelic. We went through the FDA and had an ethics review board kind of oversee the study and did everything the proper ways, but it's still a lot easier than going to one of the more intense psychedelics. So we looked at in healthies, healthy individuals, what does ketamine do to the brain? And we had a small study. It was only 15 people, but we saw some interesting results from that. And we're going to share, I think, next week at a conference, some of the preliminary analysis. And then probably later this fall, we'll release a paper on some of the findings that we had from that ketamine study. So it looks promising. I don't want to reveal any results right now. But we are on the verge of maybe seeing something new for the first time with Kernel Flow. And part of that is enabled. I mentioned before, if you kind of look at the legacy devices that were used to do these types of measurements, they all exist in kind of research settings, hospitals, big rooms that are dedicated to these types of equipment. And we just took our device to a clinician's office in Marina del Rey, who treats patients, and they are able to kind of look out over the ocean and like be in this very comfortable, more natural environment, like, calming, a great place to have that type of treatment time. And so we took our device there and did all of our measurements in that setting, and we're able to record data in a relatively short amount of time and get some information about what's happening inside the brain when a person is experiencing a psychedelic trip due to ketamine.
And so you're watching the blood flow during the trip.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just blood flow. What we're looking at specifically is how different parts of the brain activate in different sequence or with each other. So some parts will be kind of synchronized. They'll be activating in tandem, and others will be asynchronous. And so you can kind of look at how these different parts of the brain are connected and working together. And that tells you something about what's going on in that person's state of consciousness or whatever it is that is being represented by those, what are called networks, brain networks.
So then that's your software sitting on top of the data of the physical device. Just the physical device only measures the oxygen in the brain and the location of the oxygen in the brain. And then all the other interpretations, sequence of what areas are firing, all that stuff is in the software layer.
That's right. Yeah. So we have a team of neuroscientists and data scientists that kind of take both like the understanding of what the brain does and how like the function is understood from a scientific perspective, and then kind of apply data science techniques onto that understanding and the data we've collected to try and draw conclusions. So it's a really, our team is so talented in, 13 different dimensions from, as I mentioned before, kind of the device that we start with all the way up to the analysis layers where we're doing like machine learning and looking at ways to infer information from the signal we measure.
What about, have you ever noticed that people could do something physical that changed the results somehow? Like if my breathing pattern changed over the course of the measurement, like how any sort of physical change in my body would also affect what's going on in the brain?
Yeah, so these are what are, could be considered as confounds. So you would say, like, how do you know it's brain activity and not just, something due to change in respiration? And there are a couple of ways. So one, we have one heart and one set of lungs. So changes in respiration or heart rate, like pulsing, those are global changes. You tend to see them everywhere. So it's kind of a common mode signal, if you were to think of it that way. The other way is by looking at the frequency content of these different signals. So that respiration, I think, adult humans are something like 15 breaths per minute or somewhere in that neighborhood. So the frequency of respiration, the frequency of heart rate, right? Like, resting heart rate somewhere in the 60, 70 beats per minute. And so you can use that information to kind of look at the frequency content of the signals you measure and kind of isolate what is coming from different parts of it. And then you can intelligently kind of pick that out and say, like, this is not due to the brain. This is. So, but the biggest thing is that really being able to measure these maps gives us an idea of these global patterns, so we can see what is common mode due to kind of our cardiovascular system and what is differential due to kind of changes in brain activity in those regions.
Can we take a look at some of this stuff? Can I pull up like a website or something?
Sure.
I saw it a second on this one. Right. He's wearing it. But what's your website? Kernel?
Kernel.com.
Kernel.com. All right. Let's make this bigger. Boom. Oh, it looks much nicer. Yeah.
Yeah, we the version we're about to release is even, I think, looks even nicer than that. So yeah, if you can see that short video there, it describes a little bit about what I was talking about with the ketamine study. But these 3 still images here are pretty interesting, and I can talk to those quickly to kind of give you a sense of what the data looks like.
Yeah, it looks like a heat map for people that can't see it, which they should go watch on YouTube. But it looks like a heat map of the brain along with some charting of whatever that is. You'll tell me. Ketamine dose?
Yeah. So this was a pilot we did before we did our 15 ketamine participants. And what we did this pilot for was to see if we could kind of measure the difference between before and after administration of ketamine. And on the leftmost figure there, what you see is this brain map that I was telling you about. So this is a functional connectivity map. So we've identified or kind of carved the brain up into 100 different regions. And then we look at how different regions are correlated with one another. And the strength of that correlation is represented here in this map. And then once ketamine is administered, we look at how the strength of those correlations change. And so if you look at the after ketamine takes effect, it's hard to see from this this size, but what you can see is that there's a decrease in activity in a lot of these regions. And that's thought to be kind of the dissolving of some of the networks that the brain has to kind of maintain its conscious awake state. So as it enters this kind of psychedelic, more freeform.
It got rid of the red ones. And what are the red ones?
Right. So the red ones are where the connectivity was strong to start with. And then the blue in the bottom is the decrease. You see the decrease in the connectivity between those same networks. So we're looking at changes in these regions of the brains that move together, right? So that are correlated. And this is what it's known in literature as functional connectivity. It's how the different parts of the brain are connected. And really why understanding the brain requires this kind of whole brain perspective, because so much of our brain, people like to think like, hey, like this one part of your brain is responsible for X. But really, our brain is kind of working as a whole in various ways in order to execute on many of the functions that we experience as humans.
So just so I understand this right, at the top, before ketamine takes effect, there's these 3 brain sketches, graphics, and there's like a bunch of red and there's a bunch of dots. They're all like connected, right? And then and I guess this is just 3 different, what do you call them? Like slices of the same brain?
Correct. Yeah, just perspectives.
Yeah, three unique perspectives of the same brain. And then they have after ketamine takes effect, and then you see like some blue and green, but all that craziness of the red is gone. There's still like some red dots, but so that red was neural activity. So it turned down their neural connections, or what did you call that? Connectivity?
Yeah, connectivity. So Joel, the best analogy I love to use for this is if you kind of imagine all the major cities of the world, they each have an airport, and you've seen like these maps of flight paths between like major airports. And you can see that like New York's a major hub, London's a hub, Tokyo, wherever the main hubs are, Hong Kong. And you can see the strength of connection between those hubs. And what you're looking at in this map is really the strength of connection between regions in the brain. So it's like how many flights per day between those paths, kind of. But it's really just how those brain regions are connected, how strongly linked they are. And then if you think of major world events like a volcano erupting in Iceland, and you look at how that changes the flight patterns, you could very clearly see just by looking at flight patterns alone, without knowing anything else about the world. But the flights between New York and London are disrupted for some reason. Right. So there's something going on in the world between New York and London, and there are no there's no connectivity between those two nodes now. And that's a similar concept here. So that would be a blue line in reducing the amount of connection between in the bottom. So on the bottom panel, the blue would be a reduction in connection. So it would be a disruption between New York and London. So does that help kind of relate it to something a little more tangible? So what we're looking at is strength of connection between different regions.
So are there any new connections between the two or no?
No, so this isn't reforming any connections. At least this pilot analysis shows no reduction here. And again, I don't want to overstate any claims here because this is pilot data that's presented. And as I mentioned, we'll release a full publication later this fall.
Well, I mean, it's not hard to believe.
We'll go through kind of full peer review process.
I mean, the premise that drugs can slow down brain activity is not something that's hard to sell. So just being real here. So no new connections. Those are two identical maps, and this just the red color is the color that's just because there's a lot of connections there, and then so basically it just cooled down the connections. It basically is slowing down the brain the right word or no?
No, it's not really slowing down the brain. It's just changing the way that the brain is, synchronized, connected, however you want to think about it. But it's the strength of two regions working together is this connection.
Oh, you're helping me now. I'm starting to get it. Okay. All right. So basically, like, you could reroute data more evenly.
Right. Yeah. So you can think about it as like these red ones are like really deep ruts and then the drug comes along and it's smoothing over those ruts a bit. So they're a little bit shallower across the whole brain rather than having a few deep ones.
Got it. Okay. That's kind of cool. So it can I wonder if you had somebody wear it while they sleep, if you would get like similar results from the processes of like when we sleep, pruning our synapses and such.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I would say our headset today is not really designed to be worn during sleep. I think we'd have to make some adaptations in order to support something like that. But it would be a really interesting study. And what I hear you getting at, though, is just like, it would be really interesting to see what happens to the brain during blank. And you could fill in that blank with so many different activities. And I would try to argue that Kernel Flow can't solve all those activities today, but it's greatly increased the set of possibilities that you could fill in the blank with just by its new form factor and ease of use.
Yeah, you just need to put this out here and let the monkeys monkey with it.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, man. You must really enjoy your work.
It's great. It's a lot of fun. And, I should also qualify all the information I just said. Like, I'm an electrical engineer. My neuroscience training has been on the job. So, I could have got a fact here or there wrong. But for the most part, general idea is correct. It's a lot of fun learning new things and really trying to understand what are the most accessible questions we could ask and how can we ask them in a way that will get good and meaningful results. So
why psychedelic? Why ketamine? Why was that like your guys's, if that's a good word, your guys's, I don't think that's a word. Why was that your team's first thought of like, hey, is it because you guys just want to get your hands on some ketamine, like legally, or why was that the first test to run?
Yeah. So we actually had a customer come to us. So that was done in partnership with a company called Cybin. And they were interested in understanding more about what happens in the brain during the administration of certain psychedelics. Ketamine is not their primary psychedelic. You may guess from their name that they're interested more in things like psilocybin. But they're developing novel molecules to treat things like depression and anorexia, and they want to understand more how the molecules functionally affect the brain. So this was their first question, is just, can you measure psychedelic effect? Can you measure someone having a psychedelic experience with this device on? Is it safe? Are there any risks? Trying to understand what the landscape looks like.
I've been seeing a lot more literature and content around treatment using these sort of psychedelics for PTSD, for different types of depression. I just learned a couple new ones that you mentioned. So it's been, I think, the past like 3 years or so, it's like really kicked up. So the idea that somebody came to you and, did a business with you in order to do some research on this. And I don't know, can they use psilocybin legally now through the FDA, or because ketamine's used as like a vet drug a lot, right? So was it because you couldn't get your hands legally on psilocybin, or?
Yeah. There are paths, they're just more difficult. And so you're correct. Ketamine is an approved anesthetic. So if you have anesthesia for surgery, part of that cocktail may include ketamine, even as a human. And it has also been approved in a form, S-ketamine, for the treatment of depression. And so it's like a nasal spray that's sold. So these are things that are out on the market already and FDA approved. Psilocybin, it's more difficult. It's a controlled substance. So there's a lot more approval and work that goes into doing it, at least in the US. So as a first kind of starter psychedelic, ketamine in the right dose. So you don't want to go to full anesthetic doses. Otherwise, person just goes blank. So it's a sub-anesthetic dose of ketamine that produces a psychedelic effect.
What else didn't we talk about? What do we want to get out there to the world? We have like 6 more minutes or so here. I want to make sure if there's any call to action for you guys or any publicity type stuff that you want to get out there, that we do that.
Yeah, the big call to action for us is just if you are working on something that affects the brain and you want to measure what that effect is, and you want to measure it in a quantified way, then come talk to us. We're very interested in partnerships. We have a lot of things going on with other drugs that are legal in most states in the U.S. and drugs that are used for treating certain conditions. So all those things are not yet public, but they're in discussions and things that we're planning in the background. I mentioned alcohol as kind of an easy, accessible starter drug. Again, have some alcohol, we can go buy it off the shelf and administer it safely. Again, under kind of oversight of a ethics board. So we're always doing our experiments on humans in a safe and responsible way. So, to date, I would say a lot of things that affect the brain have been built on subjective measures, right? Can you tell me how you feel after I administer this drug to you, or after you take this treatment, or you play this video game, or whatever? Can you tell me how fatigued your brain feels today? And at Kernel, really what we want to do is take the subjective out of that and bring in an objective measure, which is directly from the brain. Right? So a lot of things, to get these subjective measures, you're using proxies. It's like a survey or questionnaires, or looking at things like, I don't know, your heart rate, how your heart rate changes, and saying something about how maybe your focus or attention is. And what we want to do is get away from proxies and get straight to the source. Right? So much of what makes us who we are and makes us unique as individuals is in our brains and how our brains respond to things. And, we'd really like to get there and quantify that.
Do you believe, or what are your thoughts on objective results from your device? Like, let's say there's objective results, whether it's from your device or not, just objective results of brain activity, and different people they look identical on the data, but they're having different subjective experiences. Do you think that that's possible?
I think it is. At least what I would expect is that if you look at people having a similar experience, if you look at, so let's assume for a bit that reports of that experience are normally distributed. So I would expect that the objective measures would have a tighter standard deviation than the subjective ones. Like you'll see higher variance in what people report, because what is, a level 5 pain scale to me may be a level 2 pain scale to you, for instance, right? Like we all have different reference points for how we convey what our subjective experience is. So I would expect kind of, you look at things in group or population level, you start to see these broader distributions from subjective measures than you would from objective. And if we could show that, then we could start to build trust in the objective measure that, like, yes, we were able to form kind of consistent distributions. It's not just random. And, with this, we're able to kind of more deterministically develop things. And, even if your subjective experience is slightly different, right? Like, we're applying different gain or offset to our relative conveying of these scales on 1 to 10, we at least now have an objective measure to push it in the direction we want it to go. So maybe we want to reduce some kind of suffering score or increase some sort of pleasure or focus or attention score. Then you can start to have objective measures to do these things regardless of what the subjective experience may be.
Yeah, well, as an interviewer and an engineer, my job is to find the edge cases. but yeah, in general, you can use this, collect data, and find directions that you might need to go. So maybe someone comes in and they're like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't feel like myself. They could put it on. They're like, oh, okay, your brain flow is that of one that matches this type of depression. And generally, these 2 or 3 treatments are where you would want to start. It would just help shape the direction. Is that kind of like an area?
Yeah, I think that's one of our long-term visions for a device like this, especially in the realm of depression, is, can we differentiate types of depression and people who are good candidates for treatment in certain directions? I think that would be, if we could achieve that, I would personally be very satisfied, and I think the team as a whole would be as well.
Does anybody ever refer to you as somebody who reads minds?
We get all kinds of interesting inbound things through our support at Kernel.com email address. So yes, and some of those are mind reading and wanting to know what this chip that was implanted in their brain was doing through whatever NSA or someone. We get all kinds of wild stories that come in, but at times, yes, we're referred to as people who read minds. That's
a podcast we need to start, your support inbox. But it's really great to meet you, man. Did we get everything done that we needed to get done? Kernel.com. Easy name for the tech community to remember, right? Good job getting that domain, by the way.
It was work. We were Kernel.co for a while. So it took us some time to get
How
the
much did that
.com.
M cost you? It's private.
I don't actually know, but I don't know that I want to know either. So
Correct. Well, this is fantastic. We made a podcast. How do you feel?
Oh, I feel great. This was fun. I'm so happy we got to do this, and it's great to meet you. And maybe we'll follow up in a little while and see where things are at. And if you want to come to LA and get your mind read, the invitation's open anytime.